Alright, so we've done the sketchy scratch thing. I want to show you how to input something like a fingerprint into Maya. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up with a sort of generic Arnold setup. I will assign an Arnold material to these dudes. And I am going to grab the preset for brushed metal. Goodness knows what that's going to look like, but we're about to find out. Okay, so that's definitely brushed metal. Or something. Throw a ground plane in here and let me add some beautiful Lambert. You know, I'll do something interesting. I will do a ramp shader. Just make sure this is recording. I feel like it's not. It is. Okay, great. And I'm going to do this, and then that. And then I'm gonna repeat this twice. Beautiful. And for grins, I'll make maybe this, I don't know, I'll make this, I don't know, some flavor of red. Cause ooh, Lord, that's ugly. That's also not a word, but anyway. So here we have this glorious, horrific looking texture of awfulness. And, fun fact, Alt-Z will undo your last camera move. Cool, and now our spheres look a little bit less trashy. Only a little bit though, like actually only a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and I've found a fingerprint texture on the interwebs, and I think this would actually maybe even be a little bit more obvious with a different preset. So I'm just gonna grab, I feel like honestly the balloon might be kind of fun. There's like a balloon preset that I'm weirdly fond of. They do many crazy things in this. I think they have assorted coats on this, so if you turn that off you get less of the sort of weird shiny effect. I really like the stuff that Arnold does with coats. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is basically go in and apply a fingerprint texture to this. So I've downloaded from the interwebs into my regrets folder from the last video this gorgeous fingerprint texture. And it looks really gross. But you can see it's basically just a black and white image. You can make your own, grab one from the internet if you're looking to do stuff. So what I'm going to do is basically actually how the shader is working. You do kind of need to understand this for this. So I could theoretically turn the roughness of this object down, but it still has that glossy sort of shine on the outside. This is actually not a terrible looking plastic. So what happens when you put a fingerprint on a chrome ball? It gets like a little bit matte. It's like oil from your skin being deposited on the ball. So we actually need to apply this roughness to the outside of this, to this coat that this particular shader has. So I'll go back and set this back to the default, and I'm just going to do something really, really extreme and probably very regrettable looking, and go ahead and just map that regrets texture, this lovely fingerprint. I will just slap that right in there, and I have absolutely no idea where this is showing up on my object at all. So what I'm going to do is just repeat this maybe 4 times, and hopefully we'll get a fingerprint maybe showing up. Also though, if you look at this map, what it's doing is saying, we map this into, I believe, roughness? Yes. So a value of 1 is going to be extremely rough, and a value of 0 or black is going to be not really rough. And there's a few things that are happening here. 1, probably the whole thing got a little bit matte, so probably we need to check this alpha as luminous button. And you can see that actually now we have a delightful little fingerprint showing up on our piece. It's not the best, you know, there's like a little bit of weirdness sort of around the edges. But it does definitely show the fingerprint off, and conveniently it happens to be right where I was rendering, which never happens. So that's decent start. The downside of doing this where you're like using a texture map is if you, and sometimes it is pretty much unavoidable. In this case, we could probably cheat it a little bit with like kind of sort of procedural texturing. So what we could do is go in and basically use this as a map, but For traditional file texturing, you'd probably have to go into Photoshop and like pull the black background off this, so you just have the fingerprint, and then you could, you know, throw that onto whatever texture and make it whatever roughness you need. It's not ideal to have the black base baked in, because maybe you don't want the background that shiny. There is incidentally a sort of fix for that. If you do another semi-procedural texture, you can do a few things here. One is actually mess with the like the color offset or the exposure, so you can just modify the image and the color balance. That makes the overall thing a little bit rougher. And if we, you know, bump that up a lot, you can see this is getting fairly diffuse in the background, and then the hotspot is like showing up a little bit differently. The other thing you can do if you need a greater level of control, which is honestly usually what I do, is going in and let's see what happens if I just make the exposure. Oof. That's terrifying. Exposure is usually a very, very aggressive setting to adjust, in my experience. So what we could do if we needed to is go in and... I thought I just pulled up my Hypershade. I did. Great. So I'll just go ahead and expand this. And we can either do one of two things. We can map this into like an AI color correct, or we can be a spaz and map it into a ramp texture, because I'm insane and I just like ramp textures. I find them much more intuitive for some reason. So I'm going to grab the output R, it doesn't really matter for this. It's a black and white image, should be the same thing. And grab the out color and throw that into... Sorry, out color R, and throw that into coat roughness. And now what we should be able to do, if we need to, is go in and really start to sort of play with these levels, and you'll actually see how that's adjusting the image. So in this case, this behaves a little bit more like the level slider in the Photoshop, where you can see you can actually sort of like trim away parts of the image, almost. So if I wanted to, you could do something really crazy and like make it almost impossible. It's still there, barely, you can kind of see it, but you can really shim away at that fingerprint with this. And then if you wanted to, you could go back in and like add some of the fingerprint back. I'm not really sure what the application of that would be in terms of a fingerprint, but you can do it if you need to. This is usually how I work. Honestly, color corrects work just as well. And now I'm just clicking a bunch of random buttons like a maniac. So this is sort of option A, using more like file-based textures. The other thing you can do is actually make this, I mean, if you wanted to be a maniac, you could make that green and it would recolor your whole background. In this case, we're reading the red channel, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what you could do if you wanted to is use this as a way to adjust the background itself. So if we make this also white, it's going to basically make the whole thing super rough. But you could use that to sort of dynamically adjust the background color in a way that's, in my opinion, a little bit more controllable. And you can see that we still do have that fingerprint hanging out right in here. Pretty different effect. This actually looks like a frosted Christmas ornament with some dust on it or something crazy. But anywho, so that's option one. The other thing that you can do is something similar, but then use procedural texturing to sort of make it look a little bit different. Basically use the texture as a map. So full disclosure, I've not had a reason to do this before right now with a fingerprint specific texture. So I'm just going to kind of see what happens. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to... what is this? This is standard surface. To fingerprint red. And after this I'll go through and throw the scratch texture on, because I feel like it'll be cool to see how that actually looks on something like this. And I'm also just going to be lazy and use procedural texturing for that. I'll give you sort of like a verbal walkthrough of how to do things in Photoshop, because I feel like that's probably a thing that like most people will review and go over. I went over it in a little words a little bit in the last video. I should probably play this so I can actually see what the heck I'm rendering. That feels like a reasonable thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and set the specular weight and pretty much like everything down to 0 and see what happens. I will make this super rough. Why is this metal? Oh shoot, this is my balloon texture. That's awkward. Remember when I was like, hey, do these crazy things? Don't do them to the wrong texture. Alright, so I'm going to take my diffuse weight down to 0, and my specular weight also maybe... Okay, let's see. Sure. This feels like it's going to be really bad looking. Let's see what happens. I feel like what I actually need here, and this is probably entirely ridiculous looking, is like transmission weight. And that way maybe when I somehow apply these, it's gonna be... This is gonna take forever to render. It's gonna be great. Like I said, never done fingerprint specific stuff with trying to just make a texture of skin oil. But let's see what happens. Theoretically, it should work. I would like an AI mix shader. And for anybody just watching this randomly who isn't one of my students, I have a whole procedural texturing bit where I go over how to use mix shaders. But I'm going to grab the fingerprint and the standard surface 1, which apparently I thought I renamed and didn't. And then I'm going to grab my little ramp shader and throw that into the mix. And this is going to look really... Oh, how do you like that giant red metallic fingerprint? That's definitely what I wanted. She says with dripping sarcasm, while talking about herself in the third person. Anyway, so in this case, this is maybe a little bit not so much what we want, where the fingerprint is actually clear. So this feels like maybe someone was like spray painting a glass ball and they like took a fingerprint mark out of it. So at this point, maybe you could go through and actually like play with the fingerprint texture itself. In this case, since it is going over something red, for the purposes of the shader, I might actually, you know, make the color red. And actually, I should probably turn transmission down. But hopefully you get the point where like you can use the procedural texturing in a way that will allow you to sort of fudge in the extra fingerprints without making a crap ton of extra maps. Because that way, anywhere you have oil prints, you can sort of like change it really, really quickly and easily. And actually, I'm not going to say that that looks amazing, but it looks pretty alright. And the other thing you could do in this case is, let's just set this to be balloon texture again. And then you can literally just go through and this will probably take a little bit longer to render, honestly. I've changed some settings clearly in the original one, but you can see that now we're getting pretty aggressive shine, which is a little bit strange on the object. So I'm going to go ahead and just set the roughness for this all the way down. This is behaving a little bit closer, I think, to what I want. And I could go through if I wanted to and like mess with the underneath roughness for like whatever's beneath the coat, to sort of mess with that. The other thing that wouldn't be entirely unreasonable to do is go in and put a bump map into this and basically make it... I'm going to fudge this really hard right now. I'm just going to put in a checker texture. You can see it's making a awful, awful little checker in there. And I'm going to go ahead and just see what happens if I set all of these, basically just turn this white. This whole thing is just going to be white. So what I'm shooting for by doing this is maybe like get like a little teeny bit of raised area into the fingerprint itself. And I'm honestly not entirely sure if that's really showing up super great, if at all. That's not what I wanted. Let's go find that up here. Haha. Set the bump depth up crazy high. Like a maniac. Alright. Alright, so it's not super showing up crazy well. But ideally, like, it would be kind of cool to have a little bit of, like, raised area. And this is, like, the kind of stuff where, like, you want to watch out for this, where it's, for some reason, extremely shiny around the edges of this. I would imagine that this fingerprint probably has a little bit of white around the edges, or, like, a little bit of black, or, like, it's not quite reading things right, so it's giving you a little bit of, like, weird feathering. So watch out for stuff like that. But overall, I mean, this is like how I would usually put, you know, a fingerprint on something. Honestly, normally I just do it with a file texture, but if you're going for like super different materials, this can be kind of interesting way to do it. And this obviously would also work for stuff like lip prints or, you know, water stains, anything like that. And you can kind of mess with stuff that way. So I think the file textures are maybe a little bit more straightforward to set up. I just think they're really tedious, so I prefer to just do everything procedurally because I'm a maniac. But yeah, so I guess I'm gonna stop here, and then in the next video I'll do the scratches and show you like the different textures and stuff you can set up for those.